Welcome to the webinar in week 5 of our From Linear to Circular webinar series. And this is the second webinar we're bringing to you this week. We already spoke about plastics on Wednesday, and today we're going to dive deep into what cities and governments can do in order to help us transition to the circular economy. And today I'm not joined by Seb as my co-host, but instead I have an amazing colleague, Laura. So welcome to the show, Laura.
Thank you, Ilma. Much better than Seb.
Of course it is. Would you like to say a word about yourself to our audience?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura, and I'm the Learning Engagement Manager here at the Foundation. So I work with the learning and events teams in creating live broadcasts and webinars like this one.
Great. So before we dive into our topic, as usually, we have a couple of announcements for you to make. And as you know, this is the favorite part that's for Seb in the webinar. He loves making these announcements. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. And just in case you're joining us for the very first time, so everything that you need to know is actually can be found on our Slack community, and you can see the link on your screens right now. So join the Slack and join the channel, get info to begin with, and you'll find all the relevant information there. And each week we post a relevant content in relation to that webinar in the specific channel. You can have amazing discussions and you can enjoy the community and learn a lot while being there. And also we have a LinkedIn channel that you're very welcome to join as well. And as you know, these 2 weeks, week number 5 and week number 6, are special because we have 2 webinars each week. We were initially planning to have just one so that you could choose a topic, but upon the popular demand, we decided to bring you 2. And next week, on Wednesday, we will have the focus on fashion, and it will be the regular slot on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. GMT +1. And we will also have a webinar on food on Friday, so the same slot as this one, 4 p.m. GMT +1. And just to remind you, to get most of the webinar today, you're very welcome to continue your discussions and post your comments in the chat box. Just make sure that you select all panelists and attendees as you post. And if you have any content-related questions, you can post them in Q&A. And thank you for all of you who have already submitted your questions in week 5 Cities Slack channel. We will try to cover as many of them as we can in today's webinar, and I know that already some of our content will cover that. And if we don't manage to answer them all, we'll definitely pick them up in Slack afterwards. Right, so how about we introduce our guest speaker, Laura?
Of course, we have a brilliant speaker today with us. We have Sarah O'Carroll, the network manager in the Institutions, Governments and Cities team at the MacArthur Foundation. She's also responsible from keeping alive some of the cultural traditions at the foundation each week. But without further ado, please, Sarah, come in. Hello and welcome to this webinar.
Hi, Laura. Hi, Ilma. Hello, everyone who's joined us today. I'm loving seeing the comments in the chat about Seb painting his wall. That gave me a really good laugh when I joined. It's really good to be here.
And as always, we have participants from all over the world, from all continents except Antarctica, as Seb has pointed out on the chat. So yes, it's an incredible cohort that we have. So Sarah, maybe just to begin our discussion, so what was the journey that led you here to this point?
My journey to this webinar.
Your journey to this webinar.
It's been a long journey. I'll try and keep it short. I guess I'm South African, and so my journey started there. I have always had kind of an interest in green things, and that really kind of started with my first job that focused on green infrastructure development in sub-Saharan Africa. So I researched that for 2.5 years, and through that research experience, I became really interested in the green economy for job creation and economic development. And so from there, I moved to a green economy not-for-profit in Cape Town in South Africa. And for about 5 years, I managed an industrial symbiosis program at that not-for-profit, helping manufacturing companies to identify opportunities to add value to waste. that they were generating and supporting companies that were using those waste materials as raw material inputs. So working in that world of the circular economy, I naturally found the foundation, as you do. You stumble upon the foundation and how amazing it is. And when I spotted an opportunity last year to join the institutions, governments, and cities team as the network manager, I went for it. And, you know, through a series of events, here I am.
And we're so happy that you're part of our team, Sarah. And you have so much to tell us about the work that we do in our governments and cities team. But we have a little poll to begin with that I would like to launch just now. So right now in your screen, you should be able to see 2 questions. And if you could just quickly answer them for us, and let's see what we have. By the way, as you're answering, can you see the results as well?
I think they can.
Hectic. So the first question is,
not yet.
No, not yet. Okay. So I think we will have to end the poll first. So 70% have answered, 74, great. So we're asking you whether you know if your country or city has a circular economy program. And also, if you are a policymaker, it's really curious to know how many policymakers we have here. Great. So right now we can see that, so 1/3 of you know if your city or government does have a circular economy program. Actually, if you do have it, it would be really interesting if you could share the link with us, either in the comments today or later in the Slack.
It's very interesting to see, Ilma, that we also have some people that want to become a policymaker. Indeed.
So the vast majority, 82% of you, are not policymakers. 12 of you don't know what a policymaker is or what they do, and I think we'll cover that to begin with. And indeed, almost 40 people would love to be a policymaker. Okay, I'm going to end poll now and share results. So I believe now you can see the results. Anything that strikes you?
Well, I think it's quite interesting to see, yes, that so many people know already about something going on in their cities and governments. So it would be great to read and go through some of the links that people are leaving at the moment there. I'm very happy to see as well in the chat so many people from Spain saying hello. And also with the second question, I mean, we're going to go through a lot of things in this webinar, and we hopefully by the end of it, more people will want to become policymakers, or at least we have a better understanding of what they do.
Indeed. So I think a good place to start the discussion with you, Sarah, is by asking you to define, so what do we mean when we say policy, or what is a policymaker and what do they do?
I think those are 2 great questions to start this webinar. In fact, I'm actually quite pleased that lots of people aren't policymakers, and some people don't necessarily know if their city or country has a circular economy program. I'm hoping by the end of this, you will know what a policymaker is and their role in the transition, and you'll go and you'll find out if your country or your city does have a circular economy policy or program happening. So what is policy? In the context of circular economy, policy is strategies, roadmaps, action plans, circular economy programs to implement the circular economy in your country or city. And that includes legislation and regulation, but it also includes a whole host of other things that we'll come back to later on. And so a policymaker in that sense, policymakers are the people that work for national, local, and sometimes supranational national governance bodies that develop policy. So in this group, we include politicians and councillors, as well as public servants. So it's people who create and implement policy.
And supranational level would be institutions like United Nations or OECD.
Yes. Yeah, or the European Commission, for example.
Right.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm sure there are differences, right, across countries, regions. within even the same countries and at the city scale, right? Could you tell us a bit more?
Yes, that's right. So generally, national governments set the overall policy direction for a country, and then that needs to be implemented by the country's states, which might be called provinces in some countries, and cities. And it's really important that there's alignment between these different levels of government for everything to work and for a policy to be successfully implemented. And cities in particular play an important role advocating at the national level and fitting national policy into their local context, and then filling gaps as are necessary to implement policy at their local level. So some examples to help everyone to understand that a bit more. So depending on how governance is organized in a country, different levels of government have different levels of responsibility for policy design and delivery. In federal systems like the US, Mexico, Germany, and Australia, states tend to have a higher degree of delegated policy, autonomy, or power. And each case is unique though. In centralized systems like China, for example, policy decisions center on national government. And then the European Union adds another dimension, so the supranational governance body, because it has this unique governance ability to set certain rules for its 27 member states.
So we will go back to the role of individual governments, or what individual governments are already doing in order to help their countries transition to circular economies, such as having certain roadmaps or strategies in place. But before that, just generally looking at how we move the world and the world economy to the circular economy. So what the role that governments and cities and policymakers can play in this area?
Yeah. So policymakers are really important because they help to create the enabling environment for circular economy to happen. These international institutions, governments, and cities create the right enabling conditions for circular economy to thrive, set the direction where appropriate, and be drivers of innovation and investment in circular economy themselves. So through their activities, they can drive innovation and investment in the circular economy. And that's, international institutions that can set the global agenda to municipal entities that deliver change at the local level. And if you think of circular economy as an innovation that cities or governments want everyone to embrace to get stronger outcomes, it's the policymakers' role to help make that happen, or to help create the incentives for it to happen. If you think of some non-circular economy examples to kind of help understand what that really means, like GDPR, or charges on plastic bags to reduce plastic bag use, banning indoor smoking in public places, you can see that policymakers can support behavior change in their cities and their countries. And then there's Mariana Mazzucati's famous example of how the iPhone, like many other inventions, wouldn't exist without government-funded research, development, and innovation. So policymakers have an important role to play in the global transition to a circular economy. And most people think of this enabling environment as just a circular economy strategy, roadmap, action plan with legislation and regulation and some economic incentives, but it's actually much, much more than that. In research that we published in May last year, we identified 5 areas in which urban policymakers can act. And although that research is focused on cities, if you're interested in the role of governments, these policy levers are largely also applicable to national governments as well. So these 5 areas, to help put them in context, are vision, engagement, urban management, economic incentives, legislation, and regulation. And so there's some policy lever categories there that you might never have thought of. And certainly we hadn't necessarily thought of them like that before we started doing our research.
Do we have a slide, Ilma, that we can?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we will share it, right? And while I find the slide, Sarah, perhaps you could explain us the difference between legislation and regulation, because I've definitely heard it so often used as synonyms, but actually they aren't, are they?
No, they're not. So legislation is the overarching, legislation is an overarching act that's passed by Parliament, and it sets out broad policy principles. Regulations then are also include rules and codes and things like that, and they're subsidiary legislation. So they are the guidelines that dictate how the provisions of an act, how legislation is to be applied. So you can think of it as like legislation is the destination and regulation is how we get there.
Right. Great. Could you say perhaps a few more words about 4 other areas, as we have now this beautiful chart on our screens?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then I guess you guys can keep asking me some questions, because I could go on and on and on about this for ages. So as I said, so we've got these 5 policy areas: vision, engagement, economic incentives, urban management, and regulation. And we have engagement right there in the center, because it's so critical to making circular economy work in practice. In engagement, for example, is really important to help create buy-in, to help create shared ownership of how of making circular economy work in practice, and it also includes things like capacity building and awareness raising. So it's really important to help everyone understand what the circular economy is in practice, what they might be doing. They might call something else, but is actually a circular economy activity. And capacity building. So in many senses, particularly for SMEs and startups, and actually, for many people around the world, which is why we do webinars like this, it's important to do capacity building. It's important to train people to understand what the circular economy is, what opportunities are linked to that, and how they can realize those opportunities as businesses.
So I think, Sarah, that we're going to touch upon these 5 areas across this whole conversation. But I really want to emphasize what I picked up from your explanation of why policymakers are crucial for the circular economy. And I want to know if you think this is a good metaphor, but I think we all want to play the game of the circular economy, but we definitely need someone, right, to kind of establish the rules on how we can play this game. Would that be an accurate metaphor according to you? And after this answer, I would really love to dive into what does the foundation do to work with all these different policymakers.
Yeah, I think that is an accurate metaphor. I think we like to say that governments create a level playing field for everyone to be able to participate. And I guess that's why we often think of regulation and legislation, because that often helps to create this level playing field. And I think it's also important to know that government can be the regulator. It can create the sticks to get people to behave and companies to behave in a certain way, but they also play this really powerful role, as I said, as enablers. And I think we can often forget that role that government can really play as a positive force to create change.
So economic incentives, would they be part of the enablers in this case?
Yes, they would, but we'll get there. There are lots of other things that I would like to talk about, because we often think of economic incentives, regulation, and legislation. And I think it's also important to talk about some other things that national governments and cities can do. Going back to Laura's question, yes, exactly. Going back to Laura's question about how we work with institutions, governments, and cities at the foundation. So we have a team called the Institutions, Governments, and Cities team, and we work at different levels of government. So we work with international institutions like UN agencies such as UNEP, UNIDO, UNCTAD, the OECD, international financial institutions such as the World Bank, and regional development banks. And national governments are the members of these institutions. They fund them, and they also have a shareholder type of role. Each institution has a mandated role to play in a certain field. So, UNEP focuses on issues related to the environment, UNIDO focuses on industrial development, UNCTAD on trade and development. And to deliver their roles, they carry out research, run programs, offer countries technical support and financing. So to give an example of how we work with these international institutions, the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment is a really nice example of that. So we launched that in 2018 in partnership with UNEP, and the foundation's team works alongside UNEP. The foundation leads the work to engage private sector signatories, and UNEP leads on engagement with government signatories. And we also do lots of work with the European Commission because they played a catalytic role in advancing the transition around the world. We have someone as well who works with national governments specifically, both through groups like the G7 or the G20, and we share our research insights through these groups, supporting the development of circular economy packages and strategies. But we also work with national governments directly. We work with subnational governments like Catalonia in Spain or Alameda County in California in the United States. And then I spend most of my time working with city governments like London, Sao Paulo, and New York, particularly at the urban governance level. And increasing our focus, looking at circular economy demonstration projects in cities to grow the evidence base of tangible circular economy initiatives happening on the ground that are enabled by policy.
So I guess it's a good question to ask at this point, why then we're specifically focused on cities, and why these 3 demonstrator cities that we picked, Sao Paulo, New York, and London?
Well, I mean, these aren't the only cities that we work with. We're kind of working with 50 plus cities around the world, between China, Latin America, North America, and Europe at the moment. And we think that cities are really important because implementation happens at this local level, like I've said before. And there's lots of research out there that speaks about what the benefits of circular economy could be at the city level. And we see our role now as kind of helping to make that happen in real life, and to grow the evidence base that circular economy is possible in different cities. So if you compare London to Sao Paulo to New York, those are 3 cities in very different contexts. So the circular economy can be applied in lots of different cities around the world, and that the benefits predicted are the benefits realized.
So is city the smallest so-called local community unit that we would engage with? Do we engage with any other local communities? And also, if we work with cities, what about rural communities and rural areas? How do we engage them, if at all?
Yeah, so for anyone that kind of reaches out, we find a way to see if we can support them. I think if we think of cities and urban populations growing for 2050, rural-urban migration that's taking place, and so that the world, 80% of the world's populations will be in cities by 2050. That's one of the reasons why, another reason why we really do focus on cities, because they are engines for growth, but they can also be engines for climate impacts, environmental pollution, and things like that. In terms of how we interact with rural communities, that's largely through our food program, because there's this really important link between rural and urban communities in a food system. But essentially, yeah, we're really focusing our efforts on cities because of where we see the world moving in 2050. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we don't look at smaller cities. Like one of the cities that we're working with is a small city in Sweden. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one of these big cities like New York either. But we are focusing our efforts where we see the world's biggest impacts happening.
Right, and as part of your research work, you have developed these policy levers, so perhaps it's a good time for you to share about that. And actually, I think I'm going to share my screen because I just went to our website and opened up the report where we have listed all of them. So now everyone should be able to see them on the screen. Yes, so take it away. Tell us more about them.
So we've spoken a little bit about engagement. So I think maybe I will talk about vision a little bit next. Vision is this ability for governments to set the direction of travel and to create a common vision for stakeholders to act against or act in accordance to, I guess. And so vision is that category that includes creating roadmaps and strategies. And we see lots of cities and national governments, regions around the world, starting to create their own circular economy strategies or roadmaps. Countries include France, Finland, Colombia, Chile, and yeah, lots of cities as well, like Porto, London, Glasgow, for example. And so that's all really happening. And there's no kind of single route for how these roadmaps and strategies happen. But we have found in our research that we did that most of them make use of urban metabolism tools. So that's looking at material flows through a city. They prioritize sectors for intervention. They identify indicators and metrics to monitor and measure their implementation and success. They aim to mainstream circular economy into other policy levers like public procurement, regulation, etc. And they might mainstream circular economy into cross-cutting strategies like climate strategies, resilience strategies, zero waste strategies. And the most kind of, I think what we've seen very commonly is that they're co-developed with a wide range of stakeholders. And in many cases, like the wider the range of stakeholders, the better. It's really important to be able to engage small business, big business, civil society, higher education institutions, other areas of government, key kind of agencies in the city, etc. And as I said earlier, that engaging this broad group of stakeholders in the development of a roadmap can strengthen its effectiveness and a shared sense of ownership. And if you're looking for a starting point of how to kind of start creating a roadmap or a strategy, we developed the toolkit for policymakers. That's on our website, and it's specifically created to support national governments to help them assess where their starting point for circular economy could be, to define their ambition level and to select focus areas.
And do you have any favorite examples of the cities and their activities or the strategies and the roadmaps that they have created to transition to circular economy?
I think what's really exciting, if you look at the circular economy roadmaps that are out there for different cities and for different countries, is that they're tailored to their context. And I think that's really key at helping to make things work. I think the Netherlands and Amsterdam as a country and city example is really nice. Also Scotland with the city of Glasgow, where you have a really ambitious kind of country level roadmap. So the Netherlands, they want to realize a circular economy for 2050, and the city of Amsterdam has 5-year roadmaps. So their current one is 2020 to 2025, which is equally ambitious, but looks at how do we translate that national roadmap, that national strategy, into our local city strategy.
Thank you, Sarah. And we've pre-collected some questions from some of the members of our audience before this webinar. And there is one question that I really wanted to ask you, which is how important do you think is political direction when it comes to initiating a circular economy?
So political direction, political support is definitely extremely helpful because politicians and councillors set the direction for what public servants will implement in their term of office. So we've definitely seen that to be really helpful. It's also not 100% necessary. So you also, and that's why we work with politicians, councillors, as well as public servants, because as much as politicians and councillors can set the direction of travel and create the vision for what they want to do, it's also really important to have public servants who are able to implement that strategy on the ground. And so you need two levels working together. And in many cases, the public servants will have access to information to be able to provide politicians and councillors with a lot of examples of circular economy activities that are already happening in those cities, how circular economy might fit into existing city plans, and things like that. And so these two levels can support one another.
So we often talk about we always talk about circular economy as a systemic approach, and the fact that we need to change the entire system. So it's not enough to work with businesses, it's not enough to work just with governments, and obviously governments and businesses need to work together. So how does it actually happen from the perspective of a government or a city on various levels?
So I think we have two great examples of that at the foundation that are on the website. The first is Project Series, which was a collection of municipalities in Catalonia in Spain, just for you, Lara, where the municipalities work together with retailers and private business to transition the municipal household waste collection so that organic waste could be collected separately in compostable plastic bags. And in just a 3-month period, they saw a 30% improvement in the contamination rate of their compost or their organic waste they were receiving at a compost facility. So it's a really nice example where you have government working together with business to create this change. Where next is another really great example of government coming together with business to make a change. So that's based in New York City. We ran a campaign last year that was around trying to increase the clothing collection rate in the city of New York. The city of New York had created an amazing smart map which residents could use to identify one of 1,000 points where they could go and drop off their clothing waste, so that it could, have the potential of a second life rather than being put into the rubbish bin. And so the city partnered with retailers in the city to create awareness around the map, and they used their bus stops as well as areas where they could show residents that there were opportunities to be able to drop off their clothing rather than put it in the bin.
So that's actually trying to influence the behavioral change
of the citizens, yeah. And it's business and government working together to facilitate that change.
And what about then yet another type of institutions and higher education institutions and cities and universities partnering together? I was just reading about the city of Phoenix in the state of Arizona in the US and the Arizona University, and how the city is providing their waste for university for them to come up with different things to utilize that, which is, of course, to remember our circular economy principles, is not the ideal scenario because we want to design out waste and pollution rather than design from waste, but it's a good place to start given the current situation. Do you know more examples of cities and higher educations and businesses working together?
I might have to give some examples in Slack after this, but I think Arizona State University and the city of Phoenix is a great example of a city wanting to create change based on a scientific evidence base and with the support of academia. And it's a really nice relationship, because ideally what you want is academic research that is led by the market. So what is the research that is needed by the city or business to be able to make those changes? And so I think these partnerships between cities and universities can be really powerful. I think, yeah, I think we see a lot of that as well, particularly in the Netherlands and some other Nordic countries. But I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend anyone on the panel. I'm just going with examples that are top of mind for me. I think as well, higher education institutions like campuses can be great test beds for piloting new business models, new technologies, new services, because in many cases a campus can be seen as like a tiny little city, and it creates a really nice location for startups to be able to test if their business models are working. And you know, just like cities, campuses have a captive audience, usually pre-COVID times when everyone was on campus, to be able to test these business models. And I think cities then also have an opportunity, if they would like to pilot something new that they'd like to roll out in a city. Sometimes a campus area with the residential kind of you know, student housing around it can be really great test beds to test out some of these new circular economy opportunities.
Yes, and I'm just looking at the comments, and David Chapman has something to add, saying that Warp It is a great company in the UK that works with circular economy and also Uni Green scheme, so enabling universities share the resources and thus reuse some of the things instead of buying new things. And Laura, I know that you have a burning question you're meaning to ask.
Yes, I have. I've been reading through the Q&A, through the questions here, and also some of the questions that were posted on the Slack channel. And I see a lot of people eager to hear about some examples from other places around the world. So it's especially think Latin America. I'm reading some comments and questions about that. And so Sarah, could we share some examples of case studies perhaps that have been successful in this area of the world?
Yes, one of my favorite case studies is from Latin America. It's in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And we've got a case study written up about that actually. So I'm sure someone will post it in the chat box or share it on the Slack channel afterwards. This is a really great example of a city which identified an underutilized assets, and in particular IT stockpiles, so computers and things like that needed to be repaired if they were going to get a second life. And so the city of Belo Horizonte started a program where they would ask companies in the city to donate their broken IT equipment, and they started a repair center. And using the repair center, they could provide a skills training opportunity to youth who wanted the opportunity to gain a new skill. So they trained up a whole lot of, and continued to train up a whole lot of young people about how to repair IT equipment. And then that IT equipment would be sent to like computer centers where people in the community would be able to have access to a community. So some very poor communities in that city who otherwise wouldn't have access to a computer. And so in this way, the city also then creates an opportunity for digital inclusion in the city by identifying an opportunity in IT equipment.
Wow, this is a wonderful example of inclusion as well, and taking into account the social element of the circular economy, which is sometimes overlooked. So really pleased to see examples of this taking place. What do you think, Ilma, if we go back a little bit to economic incentives as one of the key categories of policy levers.
Yes, let's do that. But before that, while we are still dwelling in the global south, so to speak, I have a slightly broader question in terms of circular economy implementation on the government and cities level in the global north versus global south, and if there are any insights or observations that you could share with us. And also just to reference to our previous webinar on Wednesday, when our colleagues were sharing the national plastic pacts that we have signed. And we had quite a few of them in Europe, and then there were only 2 in the global south. I believe one was in Chile and one was in South Africa. So why is that? Why we see so much more activity in the global north? And is there anything that Foundation is doing or is being done in the world to help with circular economy implementation in the global south?
Yeah, I think circular economy implementation in developing countries is extremely exciting. I think actually, if you think of developing country contexts like we have in East Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, circular economy in many senses is part of normal everyday life. In many cases, there are these natural cycles already built into cities to repair, particularly if you think of electronics like cell phones, white goods like refrigerators and stoves, just because of affordability issues. And there's lots going on. I think I know it's not institutionalized in the same way that it is up north. Like the European Commission, other continents or other regions in the world just don't have an institution like the European Commission. And there are lots of circular economy practitioners. I'd bet and say that there are like hundreds of thousands of circular economy practitioners out there in the world, in the global south, as you call it, and they are doing circular economy every day, but they wouldn't necessarily call it circular economy. That's just what they've always been doing. So pallet repair, wood pallet repair, and things like that is just part of everyday life. And I think that's probably one of the biggest distinctions in a way, is that we in the north are creating circular economy practitioners, in many cases for the first time, and in developing countries those circular economy practitioners exist. The challenge is really to figure out how you institutionalize it in a way, or how you enable that. Maybe it isn't even about institutionalizing. How do you create an enabling environment for circular economy to continue in informal economies, and in the formal economy? Yeah, that's all I'll say for that. I can talk about that for ages.
Yeah, indeed. And it's a really interesting question whether we need to be explicit when things are done in a based on circular economy principles as we define them, or it's okay to have them as long as good practices are happening. Like, what's the value of actually people themselves or companies themselves and governments knowing that this is actually part of the circular economy? It's just a rhetorical question in my head. If some of our participants are interested in exploring more, you can start a discussion on Slack and tag me. I would love to hear what you have to say about that. But now, Laura, your question about economic incentives, let's go back to that.
Yeah, and perhaps I think it's also linked to what Sarah was saying about creating the enabling conditions. So when I think about the role of policymakers, really regulation and economic incentives are one of the first things that would come to mind. But I'm sure there is much more than that. And so I wanted to pick your brain, Sarah, and hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think economic incentives are definitely powerful instruments to change behavior and to incentivize behaviors that governments and cities want to see. We have an example in our case studies database for the circular economy in cities resource suite about Shenzhen in China, which is about how the city used asset management, so its ability to procure an electric bus fleet and set up all of the infrastructure is also quite a nice example linked to economic incentives, because in many cases it's really difficult for city governments to just make these changes by themselves. They rely on national government subsidies or other municipal subsidies to make them work. But I think we also think of economic incentives often just about taxes, but actually it also includes financial support and other fiscal measures. So financial support could look something like direct funding for research and development into circular economy. It could be co-financing projects to support circular economy incubators or investment programs. It could also be co-financing to support the development of circular economy projects, and public and private sectors collaborating together in investment funds to help to be able to invest in high risk circular economy projects. So projects where private sector themselves wouldn't alone invest in them, the public sector can help by coming in to collaborate with the private sector to de-risk that project in some sense. Fiscal measures, so I said we often talk about taxes, so tax breaks to stimulate the circular economy. But you can also have charges and tariffs to incentivize behavior change, like plastic bag charges that are quite common to most of us. And you can also have fines to discourage underused assets or harmful activities. So yeah, lots of different ways that you can incentivize behavior or disincentivize behavior through economic incentives.
And what about public procurement or the purchasing power of the governments? Let's say there is this statistic that we heard from you, Sarah, that from 12 to 30% of the national government budgets of OECD countries, so these are the developed countries, actually go to purchasing. And therefore, if they were doing their purchasing based on circular economy principles, that's a huge power that they have to enable the transition. So how can they utilize the public procurement?
Yes, exactly. So governments could use circular economy criteria in the procurement of goods and services to stimulate circular economy business models. They can also use circular economy criteria in the renovation and construction of city buildings and infrastructure. So you can stimulate circular economy opportunities in building development. So by doing that, you can accelerate the market growth, surely because of their large buying power comparatively to large companies or other companies. City governments in particular have a unique role to play in public procurement because they also have a strong influence over the physical development of a city and how they manage their own assets. So similar to that Shenzhen example that I spoke about. So asset management and urban planning can also be powerful policy levers. So if you think of asset management, like how cities own vehicle fleets, they own their own buildings, they own parking lots, different kinds of infrastructure. They could use the data, to maximize circular economy opportunities. They can use asset management to make city assets more productive. So parking lots, for example. I know in Umeå in Sweden, the city government has been looking at how it can use its parking lots to help startups test mobility startups test their business models. So if you're testing a delivery model or shared mobility, you have to be able to park that vehicle somewhere. And so the city has been allowing startups to make use of its parking spaces, actually, just to be able to test their business models. Cities can think about how they're managing their land assets for more productive use. And they can also facilitate the exchange of materials in construction projects and things like that. And then when you think about urban planning, cities play a crucial and a critical role in when they're planning new parts of a city or the redesign of cities. they can improve access and services so that materials can circulate easier through the city. So if you think of how you can enable reverse cycles so things can be repaired, reused, remanufactured. So planning for circular material flows, and planning for mobility, kind of also in a broader sense about lower emission mobility, and better connected cities, as an example.
And also encouraging companies to provide their, not products, but rather product as a service. And there are actually plenty of examples coming from Europe of different governmental organizations, for instance, leasing wear equipment, workers' equipment, or like clothes for their workers, or let's say when they have to refurbish their buildings, institutional buildings, for instance, leasing the flooring, and I can actually share some of the case studies. Laura, question from you.
Yes, and I've been taking a look at the chat, and there have been some questions and comments about our work in Asia. I just wanted to mention that we've shared some of our resources there, and I've also seen that some people have shared some of our reports, actually the one in India that we published some years ago. So please keep posting your favorite case studies, or later on the Slack channel, so we can hear as well some case studies that we might actually not be aware of yet. But Sarah, I wanted to ask you a very interesting question. Do you think it would be suitable or necessary to negotiate an international agreement on circular economy?
Sure, Lara. That's like I think one of the most complex things I think I could ever dream of. Very good question. I mean, I think there's definitely, if we maybe start at a smaller scale, I think it's generally agreed that we need better international agreement about when is a waste a waste? What is a secondary material, to enable the movement of these materials across borders, and to be able to enable reuse, repair, and remanufacturing, because there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. There's lack of policy alignment across countries, across cities, about when is a waste, what is waste, what is a secondary material, and what's a virgin material, and things like that. So I think that's probably one of the first starting places for that. An international agreement for circular economy. I mean, I think the European Commission, as I said at the beginning, has been this amazing catalytic international, supranational governance body to catalyze circular economy action around the world. I think maybe what's more important than an agreement right now is probably dialogues, like better dialogue between regions, between countries, about circular economy, and how that can be facilitated between those that maybe are further ahead on the circular economy journey, with those that are just starting.
So we are approaching the end of the webinar. We have just a few minutes left. So one question that we saw a lot, both in the Q&A coming on the Zoom and also on the Slack, is of course regarding the current situation. So what role could circular economy in cities play to help us recover from the current COVID-19 crisis and rebuild better and more circular economy going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's still very early to really say how things will play out. It's difficult to say how our behaviors that have changed because of COVID, like, may or may not become mainstreamed into our everyday behavior post-COVID. Like, to what extent will there be a rebound to our activities pre-COVID, as things settle. But there are some things that are top of mind for us as the institutions, governments, and cities team. I think the one thing is that the research has shown time and time again that circular economy has inherent environmental and health benefits. So implementing circular economy or using a circular economy approach has these inherent benefits, and you can find a lot of those data points in the fact sheets that we built as part of the Circular Economy and Cities resource suite. We're definitely certain on the fact that cities should focus their recovery efforts on these efforts should be promoting resilient, circular, and low carbon cities. And the circular economy could not be more relevant at the moment. We've definitely seen how COVID has highlighted brittle global supply chains and what the impact of that has been within cities, particularly in food production. And as cities think about their recovery economic stimulus packages, and countries think about economic stimulus packages, they're all in the midst of it at the moment. Like, what could be the changes that they make to accelerate a shift to a circular economy? So what are the kinds of businesses that you want to give funding? Are those fossil fuel-based businesses? Could you actually, in fact, prioritize funding to circular businesses and circular activities? So to have a think about the kinds of activities and behaviors that you want to promote, like how could you start or incentivize, attract, accelerate the growth of reuse, repair, and remanufacturing activities within the city to make material stocks more resilient. We've already seen in Brussels how they have, as a city, expanded and are looking to continue to expand the cycle tracks to make cycling more attractive. And then in food production in particular, how we've just seen cracks in the supply chains, stimulus packages could be used to incentivize a more resilient food supply chain by investing in large-scale regenerative peri-urban agriculture. Urban farming is unable to provide all of the food needs of cities, but there's an important role that peri-urban areas can play in providing food to cities. And so regenerative peri-urban farming agriculture would be a great place to put money in stimulus packages. And linked to that, also digitally enabled precision agriculture technologies that we are reducing the material inputs into agriculture, into food chains as well.
It sounds like there's a lot that our cities and governments can do in order to help us recover with our economies and become more circular going forward. And I think this is one of my key takeaways from this webinar, having listened to you, Sarah. It's been so great to hear everything that we do at the foundation with the work with institutions, governments, and cities. And it's that complexity of a challenge, and that indeed it is a systemic approach, and that all these national, regional, city level institutions play a crucial role, and we cannot transition to a more circular world without them. Anything to add from you?
From me?
From both of you? What you would like our audience to leave with? And Laura, anything that stuck with you?
Yep. You want to go first, Sarah? Should I go?
I'll go first. I guess okay. I would hope that everyone walks away feeling slightly more positive about governments and the role that they can play in these big changes. Global changes that are happening, and that policy is a lot more than just legislation and economic incentives, that they can do a lot more to create this enabling environment.
I was literally just going to highlight that. I think that if something has really well, not surprised me, but it's something that I'm definitely going to remember from this conversation is that policymakers do a lot more than I thought. It's way more than regulating, and it's way more than creating the economic incentives. And it's been great to hear about so many different examples, and also to hear from our audience about so many things happening all around the world. Because, you know, I think something I usually say is that the circular economy means something different wherever you are and wherever you come from, and we need to definitely take into account this diversity of opinions and diversity of understandings what it can be, of what it can mean, depending where you come from. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you for honestly your brilliant explanation of all these, and thanks to our audience for posting so many comments.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah, for being an incredible guest speaker. And thank you, Laura, for being a fantastic co-host. Now, almost unfortunately, I'll be back with Seb next week on Wednesday when we will be speaking about fashion. And then on Friday, again, we will be speaking about food and what circular economy can do in these areas and what Vision for Circular Economy Foundation brings into the work in these areas. And in terms of your homework for this week, the homework is to go back to your learning trios and have a discussion and reflections about both webinars that you participated in today. And if you've participated only in one, share the reflections and just swap your insights with each other. And we will post that all in the Slack channel. But for now, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.